So welcome to Music Maps. So you know that I like to be diverse in terms of the music that we talk about. This is a book that I loved. I love the oral history format for a music book. I think it's the most entertaining way to probably read about music. And our guest today, Paul Rees, has this fantastic book, Raised on Radio. So Power Ballads, Cocaine and Payola, the AOR glory years, 1976 to 1986. And there's some bands in here that won't crop up very often. There's some incredibly well-known songs and bands featured in here, and a few more that perhaps are a little bit more obscure. So hello, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Simon. Thank you for stepping me into the lion's den.
Yes, here we go. So we are now on YouTube. So if you do listen to the podcast, I know a lot of people now watch on YouTube. So we're gradually getting the archive up on YouTube. So every week there will be a new episode plus archival when I find the time to get them all up. So a topic we haven't discussed. We've done this for over 2 years now, got a well over 100 episodes. We've never really got onto the AOR genre. What does the term AOR actually mean? Because I personally, for a long time, thought it meant something else.
It's album-oriented rock. So it was coined, it's this kind of American radio phrase that dates from the late 60s when there was pop radio in America, which was very much singles-based. So they hit upon this idea with the pop culture revolution in the 60s that people were listening to albums, so you could play any track off an album, and then immediately started playing singles off albums. But there you go.
Was it bands like Zeppelin and Floyd who were the first ones to kind of, bands who didn't really release singles, and the radio just starts playing the whole album and it goes from there?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Hendrix is one of them. Jimi Hendrix is one of the ones I think that they were first cited. But yeah, exactly that kind of thing. Those sort of 60s rock behemoths. And yeah, it was a date in the diary to listen to the whole album front to back with no one interrupting it.
So the book is called Raised on Radio. So how important was FM radio to creating this whole thing?
Fundamental to it, because round about the time the book starts in 1976, it became standard for cars to be fitted with FM radios in America. It was AM before that. So that was kind of like a less rubbish version of our medium wave. But yeah, so they sounded perfect in cars. And this kind of music was almost tailored to fit FM. A lot of the studios at the time had little transmitters outside which were tuned to FM. So these people would put down their records, basic tracks, go outside to the car, tune the car into the studio's FM so they could hear what it sounded like on the radio in the car. And that's it. It was polished. It was stereo friendly. It was exactly what the format was crying out for.
So let's get into some of these formative bands that make this AOR scene up. So I'm going to start with Boston. So how does an MIT graduate who spent 7 years in his basement recording demos end up as the origin point for this whole AOR genre?
Well, I think Tom Scholz is fascinating in lots of ways, because that's exactly what he was. He was an MIT graduate, and he himself said it. The notion that this music was called corporate rock, it was branded as ever after, obviously, to stick to beat it with. The first band that really defined the sound of it is one guy with a studio he'd built himself. Basically second-hand equipment, noodling around in the basement. There's not really much more punk rock that you can get than a guy working on his own in his basement.
And presumably, too, with an MIT graduation to his name, he could have gone off and done all kinds of other things, but he chooses to spend 7 years making music.
Well, he was working as a research assistant at Payola, and at one point they were looking to lay people off. He tells this story that they were going through trying to get rid of people, and they suggested to him, being as you've got this music thing going, would you take voluntary redundancy? And he was like, there's a 1 in a million chance anything will happen with the music, so no. And within 2 years, he'd left having sold 8 million records of his debut. But I think he was just a guy who, it almost helped him, the idea that he was fascinated by technology and recording technology, and the idea of his music was that the band that could cross Led Zeppelin's riffs with the Eagles' harmonies. It was pretty much as simplistic as that. Mm-hmm. And then off he went for 6 years, was turned down by pretty much every record company in America. And when they finally got a record deal, they lied to the record company and said they were making the record in Los Angeles because they wanted a professional production. And he actually did do it in the basement studio. It was all the stuff that came out, bar one song, I think. So it was pretty much an underground thing from minute one right until the album came out.
Even when they signed to Epic, they make the majority of the records still in the basement. I think he decided to make one last demo after 7 years, and the demo has More Than a Feeling, along with a couple of other tracks on there that make up this huge debut album that comes out. Neither the album or More Than a Feeling were actually a number one in, I think, given the fame of that track and the, as we've mentioned, how many copies this album sells, neither of them topped the charts either in the US or the UK. So it's 7 years of build-up, and then success comes fairly quickly from there?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, on their first tour, they went from, because they barely played any shows because there wasn't a band. I mean, he sort of put a band together. He wanted a singer, so he got Brad Dell, and he found the other guys. He was sort of playing in and out of bands with the other guys. But by the end of their first tour, they were headlining Madison Square Garden. I think that's their first gig. They headlined Madison Square Garden. So it is that thing, the record's got a spaceship on the cover, which is kind of inadvertently apt because it didn't sound like anything else, but it did sound perfect on the radio. And a lot of these songs, as you go on, some of them weren't as huge a hit. A lot of them were, but some of them weren't number one hits. But they've just had these legs that just keep going on. And infamously or famously, however you want to put it, that More Than a Feeling riff is pretty much the riff for Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Yeah.
So it does it. The influence permeates as you go along. I think they've got a long shelf life, an enduring shelf life.
Heart are another band that appear around this same time. Their debut album, Dreamboat Annie, comes out also in 1975, slightly ahead of Boston. Tell us a little about this female-fronted band, because this is kind of unusual in this genre, as we will probably talk about a bit later.
Well, I think it's probably it's unusual in rock music.
Yeah.
And music per se at that time. I mean, and Anne and Nancy Wilson were sisters from Seattle. Anne had sung in covers bands. Nancy had sort of backed up in various things. Anne goes off to Canada with a boyfriend, and they start a band, and Nancy joins them. And within 12 months of that, they've got this million-selling record. I think their experience, I interviewed both of them for the book. And the interesting, particularly with Nancy, because she was the guitar player, she just said, I didn't have no one female who could influence me, because there were no female guitar players doing what I did. So it was Jimmy Page, and it was George Harrison and John Lennon. They were the people I was inspired by, because I didn't have any people who I actually recognized as like me. And I think their experience of the music industry in the 70s is one of the great cautionary tales. And one of the way they dealt with it, I think they're hugely admirable, the Wilson sisters. The way that they just got their heads down and got on with it, was sort of objectified for 20 odd years. And pretty much waved a flag on their own until Pat Benatar harps along about 10 years later.
But they do have a couple of number one singles. There's not that many bands who can actually say they've done that, but that's quite far forward in the timeline. I think that's well into almost the mid-80s by the time that they'd been around for a long time before then. But someone else who sustained massive commercial success in the US is Journey. So a bit like Heart, they have a slightly different genesis than a typical band. So this comes via a manager.
Yeah, a guy called Herbie Herbert, who was a road manager with Santana. So the guy, Greg Rowley, was the original keyboard player in Journey, and Neil Schon, who was the sort of teenage guitar prodigy, are in Carlos Santana's backing band. And he had this idea. There was the LA scene at the time. I got the session musos who sort of played on all the main big records that were coming out of LA in the 70s, like the Steely Dan records, Boss Skaggs and things like that. He had an idea to do the same in San Francisco, sort of have a house band to make major records. So he starts Journey ostensibly with that in mind, and they were a jam band. And then I think he realized, possibly when the record company, which was Columbia, said they were going to drop them unless they started having selling some records of their own, he decided they needed a singer. And after a couple of full starts, they alight upon Steve Perry. And the band changes virtually overnight from a jam band into what they became. I think probably the archetypal AOR band. everything about the genre that is epitomised by Journey from pretty much 1978 onwards.
Yeah, Steve Perry they found working on a turkey farm, which is not a story that comes up very often in the history of a band, isn't it? So what was he up to then prior to this?
Well, he'd been in another band and they'd signed a record deal. Record was about to come out, and the bass player died in a car crash right before the record comes out. So the band sort of fell apart, and he did go back. I think it's his uncle's, I think, turkey farm in a truly rock and roll sense. He goes and labours on the turkey farm, having abandoned music. But he'd left behind. Herbie Herbert picked up the tapes of the record, heard this guy singing, and then set about tracking him down. And had to pay his way, because I think that he was living out in the California countryside, obviously, on the turkey farm. And he had to pay his way there because he was complaining about he would lose wages by going along to audition. So that he slept on Herbert's couch and auditioned for the band. They were less than impressed that they'd had a singer foisted upon them as well, let alone one who was a turkey farmer.
So the band are not receptive to him joining because as we said, they're like a jazzy sort of noodly kind of band here, and bringing in this rock singer is quite a big departure.
Well, he wasn't. I mean, he's not strictly. I think that's the thing about Jenny. He's not strictly. I mean, Perry's idol was Sam Cooke.
Okay, right.
He was obsessed with R&B and soul, and I don't think. I think, I think Journey saw themselves as one thing, and Herbert, Herbie Herbert he's the late Herbie Herbert, was quite a forceful character. So to have your manager come along and saying, "This guy's your new singer, get on with it," and he's also going to write half the songs as well. So I think, it wasn't initially well received until they started selling lots of records, and I think as these things turned out, and everybody sort of forgot about it at that point and got on with being successful.
I think if you're called Herbie Herbert, you've got to be quite forceful, really.
Yeah, and you go around smoking cigars in a Hawaiian shirt. Yeah, absolutely.
So moving over to the Midwest of the US, there's a scene that develops. So how does the Midwest scene bleed into this whole AOR thing?
Well, I think because it's such a vast country in America, and you can sustain yourselves. They're almost like little ecosystems that exist, and the Midwest is a huge area. So you get a band like REO Speedwagon, who essentially started out as a blues-based hard rock band, and for years sustained themselves by just selling out venues in the Midwest. They don't sell records anywhere else. They weren't known anywhere else, but they were successful enough to afford their own plane to fly them around doing venues when no one outside of there had pretty much heard of them. So there's a lot, and I think there's a lot of that sort of blue collar ethic that almost when REO Speedwagon go out and become successful, they brought a lot of the other music back into it. So I think through the 80s particularly, up until about 1986, this music was the music of the American heartland in the way that probably mainstream Nashville is now. It was almost, these were the national anthems for blue collar Americans, white blue collar Americans. I should add as a rejoinder to that.
Yeah, so it's a different approach. So Journey are assembled by a manager effectively, and Boston have spent hours honing the sound, but you've got this other approach here, which is basically, as you say, more about sort of grafting and hard work, and it's just about playing a lot. I think one of REO Speedwagon was driving a taxi when he got the call to join the band. So they're coming from quite different kind of backgrounds here. Why are they called REO Speedwagon?
It was there's a guy. I mean, it's a truck, I think, in the States. So the two of the guys in the band were at university together, and they walked into their lecture room one day, and heaven forfend what they were doing with a truck, but the lecturer had written the REO Speedwagon up on the chalkboard at the back, and they both looked at each other and went, "That's it. That's the name of the band."
There's too many bands to go into detail on all of them. There's Styx and Kansas and all these other bands who are all coming in at slightly different angles. But the one that I think really speaks to me is Toto, who emerged from a very different world to these bars and dives of the Midwest. So where did Toto come from?
Well, they were all out of essentially Beverly Hills, Hollywood. So the the band at various levels. Jeff Porcaro was the older brother. Steve Lukather and his Jeff Porcaro's younger brother, Steve Porcaro, they sort of go through this high school in Hollywood and they form this sort of high school band that the older Porcaro bequeaths to the younger one. And by the age of 16, 17, Jeff Porcaro, I mentioned the section, the sort of what came after the section in terms of session musicians with this group of guys. Jeff Porcaro's playing with Steely Dan when he's 16, 17 years old and going on the road with Boss Skaggs. His dad was a famous musician, famous drummer, played on Sinatra sessions and stuff like that. And he knew a guy called Marty Paich, who was Sinatra's arranger. Marty Paich has a son, David, who's a keyboard player, puts the two of them together. And David Paich co-wrote Boss Skaggs' Silk Degrees album, which is a huge hit, at which point Columbia Records suggests that the two of them form their own band and give them the start-up seed money to do that. So they basically grew out of session musicians, backup musicians. David Paich was, I think he's 16, 17 years old. He's in Sonny and Cher's band. So he's flying around the country on the Playboy jet as the keyboard player and arranger for Sonny and Cher. And then they go, pretty much the first song they wrote as Toto was Hold the Line, which becomes this enormous hit. And yeah, it's the idea that I think that the point you mentioned, that it's sort of this relatively unknown history that these guys played on something like 3,000 records through that era. So they're on everything from Olivia Newton-John's Physical right up to they're the house band on half of Thriller. Steve Porcaro wrote Human Nature for that record, so that their tentacles are sort of all through a whole era of 80s music.
So there's all these bands coming in from all these different places here, but it's not just bands that make these monster hit records. So let's touch on some of the producers. So who are we talking about? Who are the major producers of this whole era?
There's guys. The main one is Robert John Lang. I mean, I think he's the star of the book as far as I'm concerned, partly because he produced some of the biggest records of the period, but more specifically because he's clearly insane. And I think that's, the guy who was just fastidious about attention to detail, to the point where he was recording a Bryan Adams record at his home in England, his country pile in England, and he was obsessed with stereo sound and how it worked. The studio window happened to look out onto his trout pond. We'd all like our studio windows to look out onto our trout ponds, obviously, but he noticed it wasn't quite symmetrical with the window and the way it was lined up. So he halted the record, hired in a team of JCBs and diggers, and had the pond redug and rebuilt so it was perfectly symmetrical with his window. And then he was able to get back to making the record. So, but it's just that he crafts this sound that we mentioned, the radio sound. You got guys like Mike Stone as well, who worked with Journey, Ron Nevison, David Foster, who did Chicago and who used Toto on Sister. These guys are as important as Kevin Ellison as well, as important as the artists, essentially, because they were. It's kind of the last era when people did go into studios and make records and tailored them for radio play, because that's how you got successful. And so these guys were crafted in the art of producing records that would sound brilliant on radio. So they're as much the leading characters as any of the bands.
We touched on Mutt Lange there. So does he first come in working with Def Leppard and he kind of transforms their fortunes?
Yeah, he starts with Def Leppard round about, it's 19, they get him in early 80s to do their second record. He'd done the Boomtown Rats, he'd done Tonic for the Troops thing in the UK before that, and Graham Park on the Rumour, but he has his first sort of breakthrough with Leppard. And then he does Foreigner 4, he does the Cars, Heartbeat City. And every one of those records is like a multi-platinum huge record, and he virtually breaks each of the bands with the amount of time, effort and forensic attention to detail that's demanded as well, and then goes off obviously and marries Shania Twain and takes that sound into country music.
Yeah, Bryan Adams and loads, so many, way more records than we could possibly mention, but I love as you say, the sort of quirky nature of it. How I think there's one session where he leaves the session to go and buy some frisbees, which I thought was superb, really. Foreigner 4 is obviously one of his big production credits in this era. So presumably we've touched there on his painstaking and very demanding nature. So presumably this wasn't an easy record to make.
No, I think that Mick Jones, that's the Mick Jones from Foreigner rather than the Mick Jones from The Clash. He said afterwards, he had from that record, he ended up with a lifelong aversion to sitting in studios or in dark rooms. They spent so long making it. It was months and months and months of labouring away over the tiniest of details. There's another story that Elliot Easton from the Cars, because he made Heartbeat City with the Cars. And Elliot Easton said he was convinced, Mutt Lange, that the drum machine they were using, the Lynn drum machine, was out of timing. So he had them take it apart, he had them send it back to the manufacturers. And he said literally no one else was able to detect that it was out, but he was adamant it was a millisecond out, and therefore they had to change it. And Mick Jones is quite a headstrong character as well, quite a domineering character. So the two of them sort of butted heads with each other for months on end. And then I think you end up with a record that sold, it was Foreigner's biggest record. So I think everybody just sort of accepts that that's the way it goes. You go through the pain. Most people didn't make more than 2 records with Mutt Lange because of it.
Yeah, so Mutt Lange comes in, tells them the songs aren't good enough, tells them to go away and come back in a few weeks. And yeah, it's quite a demanding environment really to get his records made in the end. I think in 1981, there's 3 AOR albums all topped the US charts. There's Foreigner 4, High Fidelity, REO Speedwagon, and Journey, their 7th album at this point that they're on. So they've actually been around quite a while, a bit like Heart and some of the others. They're actually not new bands. But I want to focus on what's probably the best known track from this whole thing, Don't Stop Believing, which is funny because on release it hit number 8 in the US and got to number 62 in the UK. And I've got a good friend, Paul, who's really into these bands. And he told me that when he was a teenager, only him and one other lad even knew this song. It was quite an obscure track in the UK. He told me that he had to buy some of their albums on trips to the US. So they were their profile was presumably a lot smaller in the UK than it was in the US.
Well, yeah, because I mean, this music just didn't get played here at all. Anywhere. If you listen to mainstream radio, you were Radio 1, weren't you? Radio 2 and local radio at that point. There's no such thing, obviously, as online or anything like that. There was the Friday Rock Show with dear old Tommy Vance, 10 p.m. till midnight.
He's not playing any Toto, though, is he?
Well, he occasionally would. He occasionally would sneak in his sort of whispered, gravelly voice style. He would even sound bored when he was doing it, but he would occasionally. That was the only way you ever got to hear, and it was usually one of the ones that was a little bit more raucous in a relative sense. So there was no. You didn't see this music or hear this music anywhere, so that they were virtually unknown in the general sense in the UK. And you're right. I mean, Don't Stop Believing really was, I suppose it was Monster was the first time that the Charlize Theron film that they used it in the soundtrack to that. Then it was on Glee, and then obviously famously closed out the final episode of The Sopranos. So that sort of brought it back, or in the UK sense, entered it into the ether. Yeah,
so it becomes a massive song 20 plus years later, but in the moment, I think the producer, Mike Stone, tells them that you need a ballad for this album, and they go away and come back with this.
They had open arms on the album. I don't think anybody really had the sense that because it's such an unusual structure for a song.
Yeah,
it's not it's not a verse chorus song. It's like it almost leads you in with 3 verses, and what passes for a chorus is right at the end. The chorus doesn't mention it's an odd way of putting together a song. So it was not a nailed-on single. I think it's the 3rd or 4th single they pulled off that record. It was literally Jonathan Cain had he was one of the. It was his first record with Journey. He's the keyboard player and one of the songwriters. It was something his dad had said to him. So he had this phrase lodged in his head and a piano motif he played to warm up in the studio, and they just adapted that on the spot and turned it into what it was.
Yeah, I think it was the second take that you hear on the record. Sounds like a song that potentially they might have spent a hell of a lot of time on, but that's actually not the case.
No, I think there's a lot of that. I mean, I think then again, that's probably another stick that was used to beat them with in the era of punk and all the rest of it. They were just really good musicians. They're because you had to be. To make records in those days and to make records that worked in the formats they worked in, you had to know what you're doing. And like you said, they'd all been playing for a long time. So they were pretty good at what they did. I read a scholarly essay in America with a guy who was expanding the notion that people went on about the Ramones and the economy of what they did. And I think there's only one Journey song post Steve Perry that goes over the 4-minute mark. So that they were incredibly good at writing pops, because that's what they were. They were pop songs, and they were incredibly good at tailoring those songs to work in the format they needed to work.
I love the idea that the original version of Don't Stop Believing sounded like a straightforward country ballad. I wonder if we'll ever hear any of this on any expanded release or anything. I'd be fascinated to hear that.
It's a song called Faithfully that they had as the country ballad.
Ah, right, is it?
So that's the big ballad on the next record. So it's Kane again sitting on a tour bus, comes up with a ballad to his wife. This notion that they're both apart on the road and they'll be faithful to each other forevermore. Obviously, they got divorced mere minutes after the single was released. But that was originally the country ballad one that they took it into the studio, and Perry kicked the whole of the band out, including Kane, and then did what he did with it and turned it into, the archetypal AOR power ballad.
Just on Don't Stop Believing, it's a very unconventional song. It's quite long. It must be it must be their longest song, pretty much. You've just said there.
One of them, yeah.
Well, one of the longer ones. Breaks a lot of rules, as you say. The chorus comes very late, and it's got this sort of unusual piano sound. And it's a very unconventional track. So who would have thought it would end up with, as of yesterday, 2.9 billion Spotify streams in 2026?
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, incredible. So where do bands like Van Halen fit into all this? I think are perhaps considered perhaps a little bit more credibility in the music press and things in this era. Where do those kind of bands fall?
I don't think any of those bands have credibility in me. I think if you look at the, and in many cases ridiculous. I mean, if you look at Rolling Stone, which set itself up as the sort of arbiter of American taste, none of those bands were ever on the cover of Rolling Stone. It took them, I think, 40 years was it to put Rush on the cover of the Rolling Stone. So they were very prescriptive about what was acceptable and unacceptable as commercial music. But in terms of the Van Halens and to a certain extent the Def Leppards and people like that and Aerosmiths, the music was so successful. And the sound of the music was so successful. Van Halen wanted to change and wanted to become bigger than they were. So they adopted that sound. They got Mick Jones. They got rid of David Lee Roth because he couldn't sing that sort of music. Got in a guy who could in Sammy Hagar, and then got Mick Jones from Foreigner to produce a record, because presuming that he would know how to do it. And then lots of these bands start working with the song doctors or people who'd written songs in that field, and pretty much the sound, this sort of polished sound, became de rigueur if you're a rock band, a commercial rock band at that point.
So how do bands actually get there? So we've mentioned there that radio is king in this era. So how do bands actually get their song on the radio? Because presumably it's a very competitive landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the, whether it's exaggerated or not, there are people who will tell you when I was talking about that it was absolutely rife, others who say not so much. But I mean, commercial radio in America, like these things, that if you have a commercial radio and there's lots of money in it, then it's open to the rules being bent, isn't it? That's just the way these things work. So there was this, record companies didn't want to get their hands dirtied. So in order to coerce radio stations to play their artists' records, they hired independent promotional people. And it became this thing that called Payola. The independent promotion person would rock up at the radio station and be talking to the relatively poorly paid head of the radio station. And the enticements allegedly could stretch from a line of cocaine to a brand new car to a holiday in Hawaii to add their records.
Depending on how good the song is, presumably.
Yeah, depending on, and also that as things go on, because we're outside the era of internet and all the rest of it, program managers seem to become and to get quite savvy to it. So they didn't like the song. In certain cases, they would just tell them they were playing it, pocket whatever thing they were offered and never have to actually put the wretched record on. But in tandem with that, they started doing a lot of audience research became a thing. So in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of FM radio was instinctual and instinctive. They sort of let the DJs get on with it. So they would put a record on that they liked, and their sole research was if the phones went and somebody asked to hear it again. They started doing these things where they would, in some cases, hire arenas full of people, and they would play 20-second snaps of songs and see which people responded to the most positively. And in many ways, it's the death of creative radio, because after that, it became incredibly prescriptive in terms of what was allowed and what you could put on, and playlists became much more regimented. But so it's a combination of that, of sort of scientific, quote unquote, scientific research and general coercion to get records on.
Was there anyone who didn't want to play that game?
The odd people, yeah. I mean, all the odd people who said they did. And, you know, you speak to certain radio stations who said they didn't. But I think it was just a general thing that it's same thing with MTV. I mean, artists alleged it was the same thing with MTV, because when MTV started, very few people actually shot videos, certainly. So, but these bands, and ironically, the British New Romantic bands and artists, did have videos. So MTV was stocked with these things. And it was put out to the artists that it was going to break the cabal of, you know, MTV wouldn't accept enticements and all the rest of it. But a lot of the artists claim that vanished out the window fairly quickly. I think the same as anything, any industry with lots of money floating around, things are open to be corrupted, aren't they?
The early days of MTV. So I just want listeners to picture that the MTV only have 250 videos when it launches. So they have Journey and REO Speedwagon, but they also have Duran Duran and Flock of Seagulls. So you've got an interesting mixture of music. So we've talked about some of the peaks here and some of the massive successes with Foreigner 4 and Don't Stop Believing. When do the cracks start to appear and the downfall of AOR begins?
I think a combination of things, like I guess any music scene, it has an arc, doesn't it? A beginning, a middle, and a wretched end. In the sense, I think, in one sense, just that level of success, and they were enormous. These bands. I mean, the number of records they sold is ridiculous. They're out doing massive arena tours at a time when the music business is awash with all sorts of illicit substances. So that affected them, and then affected the creative output. Egos became overinflated, both with success and with, you know, Colombian marching powder's help. And then I think because the sound did become, it became a formula. It did become a formula, and record, you know, like exactly the same happened with grunge, as happened with as punk, as everything. Record labels are not, in general, the most instinctive of people. They just start snapping up anything that moves that could look or be made to look and sound like an AOR band. So it sort of the impact of it is diluted, and lesser bands come out. The bands that had been successful are all falling apart and splitting up, or making their worst records. And then MTV, the one thing MTV had changed is that, you know, you could listen to Journey quite happily without knowing what they look like. Other than seeing them from the back of arena, when you actually did see what REO Speedwagon, who looked like a group of welders, looked like. And so it became a much more visual thing, and MTV made it about image. And so you get Bon Jovi toddle along and Def Leppard, who just looked like what I guess a teenager in the 80s idea of a successful rock band would look like. You could pin them up on your bedroom wall. And so it changed in that sense as well. And it became a bit more, you know, that hair rock thing was galloping along shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I guess bands like Guns N' Roses start to appear. But how do bands like Bon Jovi, who sort of are lumped in with this to begin with, how do they kind of successfully sidestep it? Because Bon Jovi go on to have their biggest success in the 90s, I guess.
Well, I think they did it because of the way they looked. It was a purely that they fit in with that. You know, there's that, you know, Motley Crue, Rat, bands like that whole sort of hair metal thing. They fit with that because they had the same management as several of those bands. They looked the same ostensibly in the image, only slightly more teenage girl friendly. And their songs are more radio friendly, but they're essentially AOR bands with a slightly harder edge and a bit more rouge and primped up hair. And the first, I mean, Slippery When Wet, I think it's 1986, is a massive, massive record. And they carried that on until grunge knocked them backwards. And that whole idea of it being very much visually image based took another step. Everything's cyclical, isn't it? But like Def Leppard, they managed the trick of they looked one way while sounding another.
Yeah, I'm guessing some of these bands sort of struggled into the 90s. Were there any real casualties?
Yeah, I mean, there's a guy, Gary Richrath, guitarist with REO Speedwagon, who seems to manage to drink himself to death at an early age. There's all the usual, Jeff Porcaro had a heart attack at a very early age. So there's the usual rock and roll casualties. There's the usual bands splitting up, bands running out of money, bands fighting, and all the rest of it. I think the remarkable thing of it was that if you said, I would guess in 1991, name a genre of music that is never ever coming back, AOR would be pretty close towards the top of the list of things that you thought, well, that's dead and gone. And yet it did come back. And you're now in the situation where the last time Journey toured, I think, in America, they were selling out stadiums in America.
And that's without Steve Perry, isn't it?
That's without Steve Perry. Foreigner are touring relatively successful without anybody who was in the original. But I think it's, like we said about the image, doesn't matter. Almost nothing matters but the songs. That's all that matters. Is
the Eagles' lead singer died, and they're still touring, playing Wembley Stadium. Yeah, so that kind of proves that, doesn't it? Really?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think there's to go with the nostalgia. There is a sense of a vanished age. There is a sense that these were, it was rock on a grand scale. The sheer scale of the Eagles was mind-boggling, and it's almost like people plugged back into that without, even though many of the participants aren't there. It's music that was made and created and existed in that sort of massively cinematic, glamorous fashion that music, it doesn't happen now.
We mentioned there the songwriters become more significant later. It becomes less about self-written material and more about bringing in a songwriter, which has got some similarities with how some parts of music work today, I guess. Did this formula just become predictable in the end?
Yeah, I mean, I think if like a guy like Desmond Child is probably the most famous of the song doctors from that, and the most readily used. There's a formula for Desmond Child songs. He's got the big whoa 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 chorus, the title that's an exaggerated thing, being "You Give Love a Bad Name" or "Dude Looks Like a Lady" or things like that. And a sound you could identify at that point a Desmond Child song from a mile off, because they all pretty much sounded very, very similar. They could be AI contracts. Ditto, Diane Warren, Holly Knight, those sort of people who wrote songs to order. That's what they did. And the more you get that, the more it's spread across records, the more overfamiliar it became.
Are there any specific songs or haircuts or outfits or anything that specifically would sum up this demise in your head?
The mullet would be the haircut, unavoidably the mullet, which I'm horrified and appalled to notice is making a comeback.
Did you never have a mullet, Paul?
I would be lying if I said I didn't. Mercifully, I'm unable to. I don't have the equipment anymore to even go there. But the permed mullet making a return is is staggering developments. The mullet would definitely be the genes that Spinal Tap that seem to have various items of vegetation shoved down the front, that they're a part of this. And then the power ballad it's inescapably that sums up the music. These big lighter waving ballads that come to crashing crescendos.
What about the spandex?
Well, I always think spandex is a little more heavy metal and then a little more glam metal. I don't think, I might be horribly wrong. I think the AOR bands were a bit more, I hesitate to use the word tasteful because that would be wholly inaccurate, but I think they found other ways of looking looking ridiculous.
I think Nancy Wilson from Heart in the book says we all had the same hair and the same spandex. I think for me, it would just be those sort of sci-fi record covers that I would look at because I was too young for this, and I would see them in the 90s in the record shops and be like, well, I'm not going to listen to that. Look at that terrible cover. That I think it's those front covers that would be the one that would have kind of probably done it for me, being a younger listener looking back. Everything changes when David Chase chooses Don't Stop Believing to close The Sopranos' final episode, June of 2007. So tell us a little about the rebirth of this track and how it comes to be featured in The Sopranos.
Yeah, well, Chase, he'd created as part of The Sopranos. The music was integral to it. So he in his own head, he created a radio station that Tony Soprano would listen to. And most of the episodes, a lot of the episodes ends with Tony in his little man cave listening to music that plays out over the credits. And they would never be the obvious songs. So he said the guy did the music, was very careful to pick out these sort of buried treasures, even from major acts, not the songs you'd be expecting.
Yes, Springsteen, there's tracks from Nebraska. And I think Dylan, there was some very obscure Dylan tracks featured too. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a Stones track called Through and Through from it's a brilliant song.
It's a Keith Richards vocal, isn't it? Yeah.
Great song. And so he'd rumbled over in his head, what am I going to send this up? What is the final song going to be? And the various things were suggested at script meetings and all the rest of it. And then he happened to hear the Journey song. He knew of the Journey song. And he'd got it. He finally had it on a short list of 3. And when he suggested to the rest of the production crew, he was roundly laughed out of the room. But he held firm to it. And I think he saw something lyrically in it. You know, the idea of you take the midnight train was that was what Tony Soprano had essentially done. He'd made a choice in life that the midnight train heads you off into the darkness, and there's only one way it ends up, etc., etc. But yeah, it's that honest. What I like about David Chase is that unashamed thing. It's a great song. So why wouldn't I finish the series? It didn't have to be, you know, a Beatles song or a Dylan song that everybody knew, or an indie rock band that had never sold any records, but that you know, you could appeal to the, you know, music nerds with. It was a song that it's a great song, and it will sound great, and everybody who hears it will either know it or go, what is it? And I think that it was an absolute stroke of genius in that sense.
Yeah, I have to admit, I did not know the song when I watched it. And I think a lot of people were maybe expecting, maybe like you say, maybe a Dylan track, and I guarantee you, no one was expecting a Journey track. So that's the genius of it, though, because for me, it's a track that Tony Soprano would have listened to in my head, put it on in his car. You know, he's not going to listen to some Bob Dylan outtake, is he? Yeah.
And it's exactly. I mean, it's a series that spent 8 seasons flouting convention and doing the unexpected, which is what made it great. So, and they carried that right on through to the end, didn't they?
Was it easy to get Journey to sign it off?
No, well, everybody else had rushed and gone yes, but for Steve Perry, who's one of these, you know, he's a cussed figure, is Perry, and Perry had said Perry didn't want it. He didn't want it used in a bloodbath at the end, so he'd asked to know what was going to happen at the end, what context it would be used in. And obviously they'd kept it a fiercely guarded secret. So he held out right till the bitter end. I think it's something ridiculous, like the week before they needed to do it. And all they ended up to, David Chase allowed his production assistant to share with Perry that no one would be shot. And that was all he knew. And I think it's in the book, Perry relates, he watched it the same as everybody else and thought something had gone wrong with his TV set when it got to the end. So, but he held out for a long time.
Toto's Africa is another track that has a second life. And today they play bigger shows than ever. How did they get a new audience when others perhaps didn't?
Same. So I think a lot of this is down to that fact that there's a lot of people of a certain age who grew up through that era, who went to work in TV and film and television. When it came down to what song would fit best for this, they were immediately able to recall songs from that era because that was the music they grew up with. And I think in Toto's case, Africa, I mean, it was derided at the, I mean, it was a Grammy-winning song, but it was universally derided in the sort of the music press. It landed into Stranger Things as one of the things. They used it on the Stranger Things. And then Weezer ironically covered it in the sense of, and became one of the most successful things Weezer had ever done. So they're now condemned to have to play it every night that they're out there. And it's just sort of, I think people have come out, also like Little Steven and people like that have come out and said, it's a great song. Another one of those great songs. I think it's probably it's distance from the era at the time. It's hearing a song like that in isolation, and it is a great song. It's again totally different, totally unexpected, ridiculous in some ways, but brilliantly ridiculous. But as a piece of music and as a piece of production, it's fantastic. So I think people listening to songs without that burden of is it cool or not? I think that's what's allowed these bands to go on and these songs to go on.
Is this music more fashionable today than it was then?
I don't know if it's. I think there's a healthy thing. I mean, it's one of the things that perennially made my blood boil because I always just thought music was good or bad, and that there wasn't a badge of honor in listening to something just because it was obscure. It was listen to it because it's good or not.
You do get those attitudes in music where, and I think songs like Africa and Don't Stop Believing, I think they are just songs that people, just normal people just like listening to.
It's not to say all of these bands, all of them weren't great, all the records weren't. There's some terrible records. There's some terrible records in all. There's
same with every genre and every scene. There's stuff that lasts and there's stuff that fades away.
And it's, it's that thing. It was always a thing I used to mystify me with Jeff Lynne, that people would dismiss Jeff Lynne as if he was, but Jeff Lynne wrote some amazing, those records still sound brilliant. You can put Out of the Blue on there, ELO, and it still sounds amazing. And it's in exactly the same way as those you can put an early Husker Du album on and it sounds brilliant. They're just great at what they do within the field they operate.
The thing I've always thought was impressive with Jeff Lynne is when you listen to if you've listened to his production, either the Beatles or, he produced a couple of Beatle tracks when they came back and did a few new songs. And also, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers is, you can tell it's his production immediately.
Yeah. Like he's exactly like that Mutt Lange thing. He's got a signature sound, and it's a brilliant. The Free Falling by Tom Petty within 2 bars. No, Jeff Lynne's produced it.
There is a power ballad night at a venue where we do a lot of our live events, Paul, the Walthamstow Trades Hall. They have a power ballads night quarterly, and I was in there, and Free Falling came on, and I was with a few younger people, and I was saying to them, what a ridiculously good song this is. This is just incredible. So yeah.
Yeah, they never fail. I've done exactly the same, Simon, on many occasions, which is probably why I'm not invited out much anymore.
Yeah, they've stopped inviting you because you want to listen to power ballads every all the time. Well, that's the story of AOR. At the end of each episode, we each recommend something that we like. It can be a recent discovery or something you've liked for your entire life. So, Paul, do you have anything you would be able to recommend for us?
Yes, I do. And it allows me to mildly drop a name as well. So I'm a massive Afghan Wigs fan and general Greg Dooley fan. And I happened across Greg the other week, and he passed on a piece of music to me and said, I think you'll like this. So it's a Swedish band called Dina Ogun. They're from Stockholm. They've made 4 records. The latest album's called Manisa Koban, if you want to go on to Spotify and look at it. And they are remarkable. They sound like... if you can imagine a psychedelic Burt Bacharach mixed with Motown, it's this hugely extravagant pop soul record, and it's unfeasibly brilliant. I can't stop listening to it. So Dina Ogun are the thing that I'm obsessed with at the moment.
Have to definitely look that one up. That's a Swedish recommendation, isn't something that crops up that often. But I'm just going to recommend The Sopranos. I mean, it's the best TV program of all time. I'm not a big TV viewer. I have watched The Sopranos fully through, I think 3 times. I remember my mum coming up to my bedroom when it was first on and saying, there's this great TV program on. I think you'd like it. you should watch it. And I didn't. I was contrarian. I refused. And then I went back to it later and I binged it. I was staying up all night watching it. I was staying up till 9-10 a.m. the next day because I physically, at the end of each episode, I couldn't stop. And I was completely addicted. And now it's on HBO Max now. So yeah, I mean, it's the best TV program ever. If you love music too, because there's great music littered throughout it. So you can't beat it, really.
Great show.
Well, thank you to Paul for joining us today. We've got live events coming up as always. September, we've got Marco Peroni from Adam and the Ants, Mickey Brenny from Lush, Stuart McConey on his book about the Beatles. That's going to be our first event up in Manchester. So if you're based in the north, we'd love to have you along to that. We are now on YouTube, so every week we're posting our episodes. We're getting the archive up gradually onto YouTube as quick as I can. And you can watch us there. So if you do enjoy the podcast, please leave a review or a star rating or hit the subscribe.